I want you to imagine something with me for a moment. Close your eyes, or at least imagine you're closing them, because I'm about to take you to a place where your entire understanding of philosophy is about to be turned upside down. This isn't just a video about feminism or philosophy. This is a journey into why these two ideas cannot exist without each other. And if you're thinking, wait, isn't philosophy supposed to be universal, timeless, above something like feminism? Well, buckle up, because by the end of this, you'll see how dead wrong that assumption is. Philosophy, at its core, is about asking the biggest questions: what is truth? What is justice? What is the good life? But here's the thing we don't talk about enough: who gets to ask those questions? Who decides what questions even matter? For most of history, philosophy has been dominated by a single perspective, one that was overwhelmingly male, Western, and privileged. And that's not an indictment, it's just a fact. Look at the canon: Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, Nietzsche. Their ideas shaped the world, but their world excluded voices that didn't look, act, or think like them. And here's the kicker: those missing voices weren't just incidental. They were silenced, pushed aside, ignored. Now, let me ask you something. If the foundation of philosophy is incomplete, if it's built on the selective silencing of half the human experience, can we really call it philosophy at all? Or is it just a shadow of what it could have been?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
I know that's a heavy question, but it's important. Because for most of history, philosophy has been like a stage where only one kind of actor was allowed to perform. Feminism isn't just about bringing more actors to the stage, it's about tearing down the walls of the theater and asking why the stage was built that way in the first place. And that's where the real magic happens. Feminism doesn't just critique philosophy, it revitalizes it. It breathes life into questions that were left for dead. It forces us to reconsider what we think we know about truth, power, and the nature of reality itself. Let's talk about power for a second. Most of us think of power as something external: money, influence, control. But feminism teaches us that power is also something internal. It's the power to define yourself, to own your story, to resist the narratives that society imposes on you. And here's where it gets really interesting. Once you start to see power in this way, you can't unsee it. You start to realize that even the most abstract philosophical questions about knowledge, morality, existence, are deeply tied to power. Who has the power to define what counts as knowledge? Who decides what kind of life is worth living? Who gets to be fully human? And this is where feminism saves philosophy. Because philosophy, left to its own devices, has a tendency to drift into abstraction. It asks questions like, what is the nature of the self, or what is the meaning of life? And those are great questions. But feminism brings those questions back to earth. It asks, whose self are we talking about? Whose life are we trying to make meaningful? And why do some lives seem to matter more than others? Feminism grounds philosophy in the messy, complicated reality of human experience. It forces philosophy to confront its own blind spots and biases. And that's not a weakness, that's a strength. Because philosophy that doesn't challenge itself, that doesn't grow and evolve, isn't philosophy at all. It's dogma. But here's the thing: this isn't just about philosophy as an academic discipline. This is about you and me. This is about how we live our lives. Every day we make philosophical choices about what we value, how we treat others, what kind of world we want to create. And feminism gives us tools to make those choices more consciously, more ethically, more courageously. It teaches us to question the stories we've been told about ourselves and the world. It teaches us to listen to voices that are different from our own. And most importantly, it teaches us to imagine new possibilities, to dream of a world that is freer, more just, more compassionate. Let's pause for a second. I want to ask you something. When was the last time you questioned a belief you've held your whole life? Not just a surface-level belief, but something deep, something that feels like a part of who you are. What did it feel like to let that belief go, or to see it in a new light? Was it terrifying? Liberating? Both? For me, one of those moments came when I realized how much of my worldview was shaped by perspectives I'd never questioned. I thought I was thinking for myself, but in reality I was just repeating the same ideas I'd been taught. Feminism was the wake-up call I didn't know I needed. It showed me that my perspective wasn't the only one, and that my perspective wasn't neutral. It was shaped by my privilege, my biases, my blind spots. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. But let's take this even deeper. What does it mean to truly see another perspective? Not just to acknowledge it, but to let it change you. To let it change you. To let it challenge everything you thought you knew. This is one of the hardest, most humbling things we can do as human beings. But it's also one of the most transformative. Because when we truly see another perspective, we don't just learn something new, we become something new. We expand, we grow. And isn't that what philosophy is all about? This is why feminism matters, not just for women, but for everyone. It's not about replacing one perspective with another. It's about creating a world where every perspective has a place. It's about recognizing that the questions we ask and the answers we find are richer, deeper, and more meaningful when they come from a diversity of voices. And it's about realizing that our own growth is tied to the growth of others. We can't become our fullest selves unless we create space for others to do the same. And this brings us to one of the most profound philosophical insights of all, the idea of interdependence. Feminism teaches us that we are not isolated individuals, but deeply interconnected beings. Our lives are shaped by the lives of others, by the systems we're a part of, the relationships we nurture, the communities we build. And this isn't just a nice idea, it's a radical truth. Because if we are interconnected, then justice for one is justice for all. And injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Think about that for a moment. What would it mean to live as if that were true? To act as if your liberation is tied to mine and mine to yours? How would that change the way we treat each other? The way we treat ourselves? The way we think about what it means to be human? I don't have all the answers, and that's okay. Because philosophy isn't about having all the answers, it's about asking better questions. And the best questions are the ones that don't just challenge your mind, they challenge your heart, your soul, your very way of being in the world. So here's my challenge to you: the next time you hear the word feminism, don't dismiss it as a buzzword or a political agenda. See it for what it really is: a philosophical revolution. A call to rethink everything we thought we knew about power, justice, and the human condition. A reminder that philosophy is not just an abstract pursuit, but a way of living, a way of being awake to the world and to each other. Let's not waste time pretending the world is a neutral place. It isn't. Every structure we live within, every law, every institution, every cultural norm was built by someone, for someone. And if we're honest, most of it was designed by a narrow slice of humanity, with their own interests in mind. Philosophy, for all its lofty ideals, isn't immune to this. Its questions, its frameworks, its so-called universal truths reflect the biases of the people who shaped it. But here's the thing: when you start to see this, you realize something fundamental. Philosophy isn't about uncovering eternal truths that have always been there. It's about building truths, and the tools we use to build them, the perspectives, the voices, the values, determine what kind of truths we end up with. Feminism is one of the most powerful tools we have for rebuilding philosophy from the ground up. Why? Because it forces us to reckon with power in a way that traditional philosophy often avoids. Power isn't just the domain of politics or economics. It's woven into the fabric of how we think, how we speak, how we live. And until we understand that, we're not really thinking at all, we're just repeating patterns we didn't create. Take something as seemingly simple as the idea of rationality. For centuries, philosophers have held up rationality as the pinnacle of human achievement, the thing that sets us apart from animals, the thing that makes us capable of truth. But who decided what counts as rational? Who decided that logic and reason are more valuable than emotion and intuition? Feminism shows us that these decisions weren't neutral. They were deeply tied to systems of power, systems that devalued the emotional and the intuitive because they were associated with women, with the marginalized, with the other. This isn't just a historical point. It matters right now, in your life, in the way you see the world. How often do we dismiss someone's experience because it's too emotional or too subjective? How often do we assume that the most detached, analytical perspective is the most valid one? Feminism challenges us to see through this illusion. It asks us to consider that the very frameworks we use to evaluate truth might be broken, that they might be designed to exclude certain ways of knowing. This isn't an attack on reason. It's an expansion of it. Feminism doesn't throw out rationality, it redefines it. It asks us to imagine a rationality that includes emotion, that sees intuition as a form of intelligence, that values the lived experiences of people who have been excluded from the conversation. And once you start thinking this way, you realize how narrow our old ideas of knowledge really were. You start to see that the way we've been taught to think isn't the only way or even the best way. Let's look at another example, the concept of the individual. Western philosophy has been obsessed with the individual for centuries. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," as if the self could be boiled down to a single, isolated mind. Liberal political theory tells us that we're all autonomous agents, free to make our own choices, responsible for our own lives. But is this actually how the world works? Or is it just a story we tell ourselves, one that serves certain interests while ignoring others? Feminism exposes the flaws in this story. It shows us that none of us are truly autonomous. We are born into relationships, into communities, into systems of power that shape every aspect of our lives. Our choices are never entirely our own. They are influenced by the opportunities we're given, the expectations placed on us, the barriers in our way. And this isn't just true for some people, it's true for everyone. The difference is that some of us are taught to see our dependence as a weakness, while others are taught to see it as natural. Think about caregiving. For most of human history, caregiving has been seen as women's work, something invisible, undervalued, taken for granted. But what happens if we flip the script? What happens if we stop seeing caregiving as a burden or a private responsibility and start seeing it as the foundation of human life? Suddenly, the whole story changes. Suddenly, we're not isolated individuals competing for resources, but interconnected beings who rely on each other in profound and meaningful ways. This shift isn't just theoretical. It has real-world implications for how we structure society, how we design policies, how we think about justice. When we stop pretending that independence is the ultimate ideal, we can start building systems that actually reflect the reality of our lives. We can start valuing the work that keeps us alive, the relationships that sustain us, the networks of care that make life worth living. Here's a tough question: why do we resist these ideas so much? Why do we cling to the old stories, even when they don't serve us? Part of the answer is fear. Change is uncomfortable. It forces us to confront things we'd rather ignore. And there's something deeply uncomfortable about admitting that the way we've been taught to see the world might be wrong. It feels like losing something, like losing control. But here's the twist. What we're actually losing isn't control, it's the illusion of control. And in its place, we gain something far more valuable: an understanding of how power really works. Power isn't just about domination or coercion. It's about the stories we tell, the norms we enforce, the systems we build. And when we start to see this, we realize that power isn't fixed. It can be challenged. It can be redistributed. It can be transformed. This is why feminism isn't just a critique of philosophy, it's a philosophy in its own right. It's a way of thinking about the world that prioritizes justice, equity, and liberation. It's a way of seeing the hidden architecture of power and imagining new ways to build. And it's not just for women. It's for anyone who believes that the world can be better than it is. Here's something else to consider. If power is everywhere, if it's in the way we think, the way we speak, the way we live, then no one is outside of it. That includes you. It includes me. We're not just passive observers of these systems, we're participants. And that means we have a choice. We can either uphold the systems that exist, or we can challenge them. We can either accept the stories we've been given, or we can write new ones. But this choice isn't always easy. It requires us to be honest with ourselves. It requires us to confront our own complicity, our own privilege, our own blind spots. And let's be real, that's uncomfortable. It's messy. It doesn't happen overnight. But it's also necessary, because the only way to change the world is to start with ourselves. When I think about philosophy, I think about it as a kind of map. It helps us navigate the world, make sense of our experiences, find our place in the chaos. But a map is only as good as the perspective it's drawn from. If it leaves out half the terrain, it's not a map, it's a distortion. Feminism doesn't just fill in the gaps. It redraws the map entirely. It shows us that the terrain is far richer, far more complex, far more beautiful than we ever imagined. And the best part, this isn't just about theory, it's about practice. It's about how we live, how we relate to each other, how we build a world that reflects our shared humanity. Feminism reminds us that philosophy isn't just something we think about, it's something we do. And when we do it together, when we bring our full selves to the table, when we make space for voices that have been silenced, we create something extraordinary. We create a philosophy that's alive. Let's get one thing straight: freedom isn't what we've been told it is. Most of us grew up with a very narrow idea of freedom, something like being able to do whatever you want, whenever you want, without anyone stopping you. It sounds nice, doesn't it? But dig a little deeper, and that version of freedom starts to crumble. It's shallow, it's self-centered. It pretends the world begins and ends with the individual, as if we don't all live in a web of relationships, systems, and responsibilities. And maybe most importantly, it ignores the fact that not everyone starts from the same place. Feminism exposes these cracks in the idea of freedom. It shows that the kind of freedom we're sold, the one built on independence and self-interest, isn't really freedom at all. It's just privilege dressed up as a universal ideal. And let's not pretend that's accidental. If your version of freedom depends on ignoring someone else's reality, then it's not freedom, it's power, and not the kind you should feel proud of. The truth is, freedom means nothing if it isn't shared. If your freedom comes at the expense of someone else's, then it's hollow. Feminism doesn't just critique this, it rebuilds freedom from the ground up. It shifts the focus from the individual to the collective. It asks us to imagine freedom not as something you take, but as something you create together. And that's a far more radical idea than it sounds. Let's break it down. The freedom most of us think of is based on the idea of choice. But what good is choice if the options are limited, or if the consequences of your choice are shaped by forces you can't control? Take something as basic as work. You might have the freedom to choose your career, but does that choice really feel free if you're boxed in by economic inequality, discrimination, or unpaid responsibilities at home? Or consider speech. Sure, you might have the right to say whatever you want, but how free is that speech if no one's listening, or if speaking up puts you at risk? Feminism shines a light on these hidden barriers. It shows us that freedom isn't just about having options, it's about having meaningful options. It's about creating the conditions where everyone, not just a lucky few, can live with dignity, security, and self-determination. And that requires looking beyond the surface. It means recognizing that freedom isn't just personal, it's structural. But here's the twist: when you start to think about freedom in this way, it doesn't feel smaller. It feels bigger. The individualistic version of freedom tells you that you're on your own, free to succeed, but also free to fail, with no one to catch you if you fall. The feminist version of freedom is completely different. It says that your freedom is tied to mine, and mine to yours. It says that freedom isn't about breaking ties, it's about strengthening them. It's about building relationships, communities, and systems that allow all of us to thrive. Let's take this even further. What if freedom isn't just about what we do, but about who we are? What if it's not just about breaking chains, but about becoming more fully ourselves? Feminism invites us to think about freedom not as an external goal, but as an internal transformation. It asks us to imagine a world where we don't just survive, but where we truly live, where we embrace our full humanity in all its complexity. And that's the ultimate challenge, isn't it? To live fully. To be free, not just from oppression, but from the fear, shame, and doubt that keep us from being who we are. To create a world where everyone has the chance to do the same. That's what feminism reveals about freedom. It's not just about changing the world, it's about changing ourselves. And that's the hardest, most important work we can do. So here's the final thought I want to leave you with: freedom isn't static. It's not a destination. It's a relationship between you and the world, between you and others, between you and yourself. And like any relationship, it requires care, commitment, and courage. It requires us to show up not just for ourselves, but for each other. Because in the end, freedom is something we create together. And the more we create it, the more we realize it was never about independence at all. It was always about connection.